Dr. Kim Hyun rubbed his tired eyes as he stared at the holographic display floating above his desk. The numbers on the screen made no sense. According to the deep space monitoring equipment, an entire solar system had simply vanished from existence 3 days ago. Not destroyed, not moved, but completely gone as if it had never existed at all. The Kepler station was humanity's most advanced early warning system, positioned at the edge of known space to watch for any threats that might approach Earth and its colonies. For 15 years, Kim Hyun had worked at this lonely outpost, tracking asteroids and monitoring distant star formations. He had seen many strange things in deep space, but nothing like this. He walked to the observation deck and looked out at the endless field of stars. Somewhere out there, something was moving through the galaxy, and it was destroying everything in its path. The first reports had come from the Outer Rim territories 6 months ago. A mining colony on Kepler 442b had stopped responding to communication attempts. When rescue ships arrived, they found empty space where the planet should have been. At first, the authorities thought it was a communication error, or perhaps a navigation mistake. Planets did not simply disappear. But then more reports came in. The industrial world of Nova Brisbane was gone. The research station orbiting Proxima Centauri had vanished. Entire civilizations that had existed for thousands of years were being wiped out without a trace. Kim Hyun called up the data files on his computer and began reviewing the pattern of disappearances. Whatever was causing this destruction was moving in a straight line toward the inner galaxy, toward Earth. He calculated the speed of advancement and felt his blood turn cold. At this rate, the phenomenon would reach human space within 18 months. The door to his office opened and his assistant, Dr. Park Min-soo, entered, carrying a cup of coffee and a worried expression. Park had been tracking the same data and had reached similar conclusions. "Have you seen the latest report from the Altarian sector?" Park asked, setting the coffee on Kim Hyun's desk. Kim Hyun shook his head. The Altarians were one of the oldest and most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. Their technology was centuries ahead of human development, and their military was considered nearly invincible. They sent a full battle fleet to investigate the disappearances. Park continued. 50 of their most advanced warships equipped with weapons that could crack a moon in half. What happened to them? The same thing that happened to everything else. Gone. The last transmission from their flagship lasted exactly 14 seconds. The ship's captain was reporting that they had made contact with some kind of massive entity, and then the signal cut to static. Kim Hyun leaned back in his chair and tried to process this information. If the Altarians could not stop whatever was destroying these worlds, then humanity had little hope of surviving an encounter with it. Over the following weeks, more reports arrived at Kepler Station. The crystalline beings of Vega Prime, who had mastered energy manipulation on a planetary scale, had been consumed. The ancient machine consciousness of Proxima, which had existed as pure digital intelligence for millions of years, was also gone. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. A brief encounter, a few seconds of confused transmissions, and then nothing but empty space. The few survivors who managed to escape in emergency pods all told similar stories. They described an entity of impossible size, stretching across light years of space. It appeared as a writhing mass of absolute darkness that seemed to absorb light itself. Matter, energy, and even the fabric of space-time dissolved when it made contact with this cosmic horror. But the most disturbing aspect of the survivor accounts was not the creature's size or destructive power. It was the intelligence behind the destruction. This was not some mindless force of nature like a black hole or a supernova. The entity was actively hunting, selecting its targets with purpose and intent. It seemed drawn to worlds with complex life forms and advanced civilizations, ignoring barren planets and empty space. Admiral Park Dong-min arrived at Kepler Station 2 months later with a full escort of military vessels. He was a veteran commander who had fought in the Centauri Wars and had never lost a battle. His reputation for strategic thinking and calm leadership under pressure made him the ideal choice to coordinate humanity's response to this unprecedented threat. The admiral reviewed all of Kim Hyun's data and spoke with every available survivor from the destroyed worlds. His conclusion was grim but straightforward. Humanity was facing an extinction-level event, and conventional military tactics would be useless against this enemy. "We need to understand what this thing is and what it wants," the admiral told Kim Hyun during one of their planning sessions. Every species that has encountered it has tried the same approach: massive military response with overwhelming firepower, and every one of them has failed completely. Kim Hyun pulled up a holographic map showing the entity's path of destruction. The pattern was becoming clearer with each new report. The creature was not moving randomly through space but following established trade routes and communication networks between civilizations. "It knows where to find us," Kim Hyun observed. "Somehow it can identify worlds with intelligent life and complex societies. It's not interested in empty planets or primitive species. It specifically targets advanced civilizations." The Admiral studied the map and nodded grimly, which means it's learning. Each world it destroys teaches it more about where to find the next target. As if to confirm their worst fears, long-range sensors detected a massive gravitational disturbance approaching the outer colonies. The entity had consumed the last of the rim territories and was now moving into human space. Emergency broadcasts went out to all inhabited worlds, warning civilian populations to prepare for evacuation. But even as the military prepared for a hopeless battle and civilians packed their belongings for refugee ships, Kim Hyun could not stop thinking about one detail from the survivor reports. Every witness had described the same overwhelming sensation of loneliness emanating from the creature, as if its destructive hunger was driven by some profound cosmic isolation that had lasted for millions of years. Captain Lee Sung-ho stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Incheon, watching the tactical display with growing dread. 300 ships from 12 different species formed humanity's last line of defense, spread across the Titan orbital zone in what military strategists called Formation Delta 7. It was the same defensive pattern that had failed spectacularly for every other civilization that had faced this threat. The crew worked quietly at their stations, checking weapon systems and running final diagnostics on their shields. Everyone knew they were about to face something that had destroyed species far more advanced than humanity. The Altarians had possessed energy weapons that could vaporize asteroids. The machine consciousness of Proxima had computational power beyond human understanding. None of it had mattered when they encountered the entity. Lieutenant Commander Yoon So-young reported from the sensor station. "Captain, we're detecting massive gravitational distortions at the edge of the system. Whatever is coming, it's bigger than our long-range scans suggested." Lee Sung-ho nodded and opened a communication channel to the other ships in the fleet. The massive Arcturian dreadnought Starbreaker floated nearby, its hull bristling with plasma cannons that could crack a small moon. Beside it, the sleek Centauri destroyers maintained perfect formation, their quantum torpedo tubes loaded and ready. "All ships, this is Captain Lee of the Incheon. We know what we're facing today. Every military force that has encountered this entity has been destroyed completely. But we have one advantage that the others did not have. We know it's coming and we're ready for it." The response was immediate. Captain Torres of the Earth battleship Sol confirmed readiness. Commander Vektar of the Altarian refugee fleet reported all weapon systems online. Even the normally silent artificial intelligence controlling the Proxima defense platform acknowledged the communication with a brief data burst. 30 minutes later, space itself began to tear apart. The entity emerged from hyperspace like a living nightmare made of absolute darkness. It stretched across millions of kilometers, a writhing mass of shadow that seemed to devour light itself. Where it touched the fabric of space, reality bent and twisted in ways that hurt to look at directly. The thing was not just large but fundamentally wrong, as if the universe was rejecting its very existence. "All ships open fire," Lee Sung-ho commanded. The combined fleet unleashed everything they had. Plasma beams lanced out from the human cruisers, their blue-white energy bright enough to blind unprotected eyes. The Arcturian dreadnought's main guns fired antimatter shells that exploded with the force of small stars. Quantum torpedoes from the Centauri destroyers created temporary black holes designed to tear apart enemy vessels at the subatomic level. For a moment, it seemed like their weapons were having an effect. Sections of the entity's dark surface flickered and wavered under the assault. But then something terrible happened. Instead of being damaged by their attacks, the creature began to absorb the energy, growing larger and more solid with each passing second. "Impossible," whispered the tactical officer. "It's feeding on our weapons fire." The entity's response was swift and devastating. Tendrils of living darkness shot out from its main body, moving faster than human reflexes could follow. The first tendril touched the Centauri destroyer Lightbringer, and the ship simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not vaporized, but gone as if it had never been built. Panic spread through the fleet communications. Captain Torres of the Sol was shouting orders to his crew when a second tendril reached his battleship. The massive vessel, which had survived 3 major wars and countless smaller conflicts, vanished without even leaving debris behind. All ships scatter, Lee Sung-ho ordered, but it was already too late. The entity was adapting to their tactics in real time, learning from each ship it consumed. Its tendrils moved with increasing precision, picking off vessels one by one regardless of their evasive maneuvers. The Arcturian dreadnought Starbreaker made a final desperate attempt to damage the creature. It powered up its planetary bombardment system, a weapon designed to sterilize entire continents, and fired at point-blank range. The beam struck the entity's center mass and simply disappeared, absorbed like everything else. A tendril larger than the dreadnought itself wrapped around the Starbreaker. For a brief moment, the massive warship's hull began to buckle under impossible forces. Then it was gone, leaving nothing but empty space and the horrified screams of surviving crew members on the communication channels. But it was not just the physical destruction that terrified the survivors. As each ship disappeared, the crews experienced something far worse than death. In the final moments before their vessels were consumed, they felt the entity's mind touching theirs. It was ancient beyond measurement, filled with a hunger that went far deeper than the need for mere sustenance. The creature was lonely. This revelation came through the emergency broadcasts from doomed ships. Crew members reported overwhelming sensations of cosmic isolation, as if they were experiencing the memories of a being that had been alone since the beginning of time. The entity was not destroying civilizations out of malice or territorial expansion. It was consuming them in a desperate attempt to fill an emptiness that had grown for billions of years. "Captain," Yoon So-young called out from her station, her voice shaking. "The thing is heading straight for Earth. At current speed, it will reach the inner system in 6 hours." Lee Sung-ho looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. They had witnessed the complete destruction of humanity's greatest military force in less than 20 minutes. Conventional weapons were not just useless against this entity, they actually made it stronger. "Signal general retreat to all surviving ships," he ordered. "Get emergency broadcasts to Earth and all the colonies. Tell them that military resistance is impossible. Anyone who can evacuate needs to leave now." As the Incheon fled toward the inner system with the few other surviving vessels, Lee Sung-ho could not stop thinking about what his crew had felt during those final moments of contact with the entity. The creature was not evil in any way humans could understand. It was something far more tragic than that. It was the last of its kind, and it had been alone for so long that it had forgotten how to exist without consuming others. Dr. Choi Yoon-young sat alone in her small office aboard the research station Harmony, surrounded by stacks of data files and survivor reports. While the rest of the galaxy prepared for war or evacuation, she had chosen a different path. Instead of trying to find ways to destroy the entity, she was attempting to understand it. The research station orbited Neptune, far from the panic that had gripped Earth's inner colonies. Here, Yoon-young could work in peace, analyzing every piece of information that had been gathered about the creature over the past 18 months. She had read thousands of witness accounts, studied sensor readings from destroyed ships, and interviewed every survivor who had encountered the entity and lived to tell about it. What she had discovered changed everything. The entity was not randomly destroying civilizations. There was a clear pattern to its behavior that everyone else had missed. Planets inhabited by simple life forms were completely ignored. Worlds with primitive species that had not yet developed complex social structures were passed by without a second look. The creature only consumed civilizations that had achieved a certain level of emotional and social development. Yoon-young pulled up a holographic map showing the entity's path of destruction over the past year. Every consumed world had been home to species that understood concepts like friendship, love, family bonds, and community cooperation. The more complex the social structures, the more likely the world was to be targeted. She heard footsteps in the corridor outside her office and looked up to see Young-soo Kim approaching with a tray of food. He was a supply technician on the station, responsible for maintaining their food stores and ensuring the small crew had regular meals. Over the past few weeks, he had made a habit of bringing Eun-young dinner when she worked late into the night shift. "You need to eat something," Young-soo said, setting the tray on her desk next to the scattered reports. "You have been working for 14 hours straight." Yoon-young smiled gratefully and picked up the bowl of soup he had prepared. Young-soo always seemed to know exactly what she needed, whether it was a hot meal or just someone to listen while she worked through her theories. His kindness reminded her of why she had chosen to study xenopsychology in the first place. Understanding how different minds worked was the key to building bridges between species. "I think I figured out what the entity wants," she said, taking a sip of the soup. "Everyone assumes it's trying to destroy us, but that's not right. It's trying to connect with us." Young-soo sat down in the chair across from her desk and listened carefully as she explained her findings. The entity appeared to be drawn to worlds with complex emotional relationships because it was seeking something it had never experienced. Every survivor report mentioned the same overwhelming sensation of loneliness that came from the creature's mind during the final moments before ships were consumed. "It's been alone for millions of years," Yoon-young continued. "Imagine being the last of your species, drifting through empty space with no one to talk to, no one who understands what you are. The loneliness would eventually drive you insane." She pulled up psychiatric profiles from the survivor interviews. Every person who had felt the entity's mind described the same thing: a crushing sense of isolation that went far beyond anything humans could imagine. The creature had been alone since before most star systems had formed, watching younger species develop the kinds of relationships it could never have. So it consumes entire civilizations to try to understand what it's missing, Young-soo said, beginning to grasp her theory. But consuming them doesn't actually give it what it wants. Exactly. It absorbs their memories and experiences, but that only makes the loneliness worse. It knows what connection feels like from the outside, but it has never actually experienced it itself. So it keeps searching, keeps consuming, hoping the next civilization will somehow fill the emptiness. Yoon-young showed him brain scans from survivors who had been exposed to the entity's presence. The neural patterns were unlike anything in medical literature. The creature's loneliness was so profound that brief contact with its mind could cause permanent psychological changes in other species. Several survivors had required years of therapy to recover from just a few seconds of mental contact. Young-soo studied the data quietly, his face growing more thoughtful with each page. He understood people in a way that went beyond formal education. Working in food service had taught him to read emotions and recognize what others needed, even when they could not express it themselves. "What if we tried talking to it?" he asked finally. "I mean really talking, not just sending military threats or surrender offers. What if someone approached it the way you would approach any lonely person?" Eun-young looked up from her files, surprised by the suggestion. "The military would never approve that kind of mission. They think the entity is too dangerous for diplomatic contact. But you don't think it's dangerous by choice, do you?" Young-soo continued. "From what you're telling me, it sounds like something that's in pain and doesn't know how to stop hurting itself and others." Over the following days, Eun-young developed her theory further with Young-soo's help. He had an intuitive understanding of how loneliness affected behavior that proved invaluable in analyzing the entity's actions. Together, they created a comprehensive psychological profile of the creature that painted a very different picture from the military's assessment. The entity was not a cosmic predator hunting for prey. It was more like a lost child that had been wandering alone for so long, it had forgotten how to ask for help. Its destructive behavior was a desperate attempt to connect with others, but it only knew how to absorb rather than communicate. When Yoon-young finally presented her findings to the Emergency Council on Earth, the response was exactly what she had expected. Military commanders dismissed her conclusions as irrelevant speculation. Political leaders argued that the creature's motivations didn't matter if humanity would be extinct within weeks. But Young-soo had listened to every word of her presentation, and he understood something that the others had missed. Sometimes the most dangerous situations could be resolved not through force or cleverness, but through simple human compassion. That night, as evacuation ships prepared to leave Earth's colonies and military forces positioned themselves for a final hopeless battle, Young-soo Kim began planning something that had never been attempted in galactic history. He was going to invite the loneliest being in the universe to share a meal. The Voidwalker entered the Sol system like a living nightmare given form, Jupiter's massive bulk seemed tiny beside the cosmic entity that stretched across millions of kilometers of space. The creature's presence warped reality itself, causing the gas giant's famous Great Red Spot to collapse as gravitational forces beyond comprehension pulled at the planet's atmosphere. On Earth, emergency broadcasts played continuously across every communication channel. Civilian evacuation ships lifted off by the thousands, carrying refugees toward distant colonies that might survive what was coming. The lucky ones had secured passage on fast courier vessels that could reach the outer rim territories within weeks. The unlucky ones waited in overcrowded shelters, hoping transport would arrive before the entity reached the inner planets. Admiral Park. Dongmin coordinated humanity's final defense from his command ship positioned near Mars. The fleet had been reduced to less than 50 vessels after the disaster at Titan, but they maintained their positions despite knowing their fate was already sealed. Every captain understood they were not fighting to win, but to buy time for the evacuation ships to escape. "Sir, the entity has begun consuming Jupiter's outer moons," reported Commander Kim Ji-woo from the sensor station. "Europa and Ganymede are gone. The gravitational disturbances are affecting Saturn's ring system." The Admiral watched the tactical display with grim fascination. The entity moved through space like a vast ocean of living darkness, its tendrils reaching out to taste each celestial body it encountered. Moons disappeared entirely while planets were stripped of their atmospheres before being abandoned as empty rocks. But this was not random destruction. The creature seemed to be searching for something specific among the worlds of the Sol system. It ignored the lifeless rock of Mercury and barely paused at the toxic clouds of Venus. Its attention was focused entirely on the third planet from the Sun, where billions of humans lived in cities that glowed like jewels against the darkness. Young-Soo. Kim watched the same displays from his position aboard the supply ship Aurora, a small civilian transport he had requisitioned for his unauthorized mission. The ship's cargo bay was filled not with weapons or military equipment, but with carefully selected items that represented human culture and connection. He had spent 3 days gathering materials from across the research station Harmony. Photo albums showing families celebrating together, audio recordings of children laughing at playgrounds, video messages from lovers separated by war, letters between friends sharing their deepest thoughts, music that captured the full range of human emotion from joy to sorrow to hope. Dr. Choi Yoon-young sat beside him in the transport's tiny cockpit, her laptop displaying the psychological profile they had developed of the entity. She had tried to convince him to abandon this mission, arguing that approaching the creature was suicide, but Young-Soo had remained determined to try something that no other species had attempted. "The military communications are reporting massive electromagnetic disturbances," Yoon-young said, monitoring the radio channels. "The entity's presence is disrupting electronics across the inner system. We might lose contact with Earth soon." Young-Soo adjusted their course to intercept the creature's path before it could reach Mars and the waiting defense fleet. His plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Instead of attacking or fleeing from the cosmic horror, he would approach it with an open invitation to communicate. The Aurora was equipped with the most advanced communication arrays available to civilian vessels, modified to broadcast on every frequency simultaneously. Young-Soo had programmed the system to transmit the cultural materials he had gathered, presenting them as gifts rather than weapons or threats. As they drew closer to the entity, both humans began to feel its presence pressing against their minds. The loneliness was overwhelming, like standing at the bottom of an ocean of sadness that had been growing deeper for millions of years. Yoon-young had read about this sensation in survivor reports, but experiencing it directly was far worse than any description could convey. "I can feel its pain," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's been alone for so long that it doesn't remember what connection feels like anymore." The entity's massive form filled their view screen, a writhing mass of absolute darkness that seemed to absorb light itself. Tendrils the size of continents moved through space with impossible grace, each one capable of destroying entire fleets. But Young-Soo saw something different when he looked at the creature. Where others saw tentacles of destruction, he saw arms reaching out in desperate hope for contact. "Beginning transmission," he announced, activating the communication system. The first signal went out toward the entity, carrying a simple audio recording of a grandmother singing a lullaby to her grandchild. The sound was gentle and warm, filled with the kind of unconditional love that formed the foundation of human families. Young-soo followed it with a video of friends sharing a meal together, laughing at stories and enjoying each other's company. The entity's movement slowed noticeably as the transmissions reached it. For the first time since entering the system, the creature hesitated instead of advancing directly toward its target. Tendrils that had been reaching toward Mars pulled back slightly, as if the cosmic horror was trying to process something completely unfamiliar. Young-soo activated the ship's external speakers and began to speak directly to the entity, his voice carrying across space through radio waves and quantum frequencies that might penetrate the creature's alien consciousness. "Hello," he said simply. "My name is Young-soo Kim, and I come from a planet called Earth. I know you have been alone for a very long time, and I know you are hungry for something that you cannot find by consuming worlds. I would like to share something with you that might help." He paused, looking at the massive form that could destroy his tiny ship without effort, and then continued with the most human gesture imaginable. "I have prepared a meal and I would like to invite you to join me, not to fight or to surrender, but just to sit together and share food like friends do. Everyone deserves to have someone to eat with." The entity's response was immediate and terrifying. Every tendril suddenly focused on their small transport, moving with deadly precision toward the ship that dared to approach with words instead of weapons. The Voidwalker's massive tendrils surrounded Young-soo's small transport ship like the fingers of an enormous hand. Each tendril was larger than Earth's biggest mountains, made of living darkness that seemed to bend light around itself. But instead of crushing the tiny vessel as everyone expected, the entity held it gently, as if afraid that too much pressure might break something precious. Young-soo sat calmly in his pilot's chair, watching the cosmic horror examine his ship with what could only be described as curiosity. Dr. Choi Yoon-young gripped her seat beside him, her face pale with terror and wonder. Through the ship's sensors, they could feel the entity's ancient mind touching the edges of their consciousness. But the contact was surprisingly gentle. The creature had stopped its advance toward Mars completely. The military fleet waiting near the red planet maintained their defensive positions, but their weapons remained powered down. Admiral Park Dong-min had ordered them to hold fire after witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. The cosmic destroyer had actually responded to a peaceful approach. Young-soo activated his ship's internal communication system and began broadcasting directly to the entity surrounding them. His voice was steady and calm, the same tone he used when comforting frightened children or helping elderly passengers aboard transport vessels. "I know you are confused," he said, speaking toward the darkness that pressed against their hull. "No one has ever offered you friendship before. Every species you have encountered has tried to fight you or run away from you. But I am not here to do either of those things." He stood up from his chair and walked to the ship's tiny galley, a small food preparation area barely large enough for one person. The entity's attention followed his movement, and Young-soo could feel alien thoughts trying to understand what he was doing. He pulled ingredients from storage compartments and began preparing a simple meal. "This is how humans show care for each other," he explained, heating water for rice and chopping vegetables for soup. "When someone is hungry or lonely or scared, we make food for them. Sharing a meal together is one of the most important ways we connect with other people." The entity's massive form shuddered as unfamiliar concepts flowed through its consciousness. For millions of years, it had absorbed the memories of countless civilizations, experiencing their relationships secondhand through the minds it consumed. But it had never been offered a direct invitation to participate in the very connections it desperately sought. Dr. Yoon-young monitored the creature's brainwave patterns through their modified sensors. The readings were unlike anything in scientific literature. The entity's mental activity was shifting from the chaotic hunger patterns they had observed during its attacks to something more structured and curious. It was actually trying to understand what Young-soo was offering. "The electromagnetic signatures are changing," she reported quietly. "Its neural activity is becoming more organized, less aggressive. I think it's trying to communicate with us." As if responding to her words, the ship's communication systems suddenly activated on their own. But instead of the usual electronic signals, something far more complex flowed through the circuits. Images began appearing on their screens, but not images from any human database. These were memories from the entity itself, scenes from civilizations that had been consumed thousands of years ago. Young-Soo continued cooking while watching the alien memories play out on the monitors around him. He saw crystal beings on a world of living glass, their thoughts creating music that resonated through their planet's core. He witnessed machine intelligences sharing data in patterns that resembled human hugs. He observed energy creatures that painted with starlight, creating art that spanned entire solar systems. "You remember all of them," he said softly, stirring the soup as it simmered. "Every species you consumed, every relationship you absorbed. You carry their memories inside you, but you have never experienced what they felt for yourself." The entity's response came not as words, but as raw emotion, transmitted directly into their minds. Loneliness so profound it felt like drowning, hunger that went far beyond physical need, desperation that had grown over millions of years of solitude, and beneath it all, a hope so fragile that the creature barely dared to acknowledge its existence. Young-Soo served the meal into 2 bowls, adding seasoning with the care of someone preparing food for an honored guest. The rice was perfectly cooked, the vegetables tender but still crisp, the broth rich with flavor that came from patience and attention to detail. He carried 1 bowl to his seat and placed the other on the small table beside Dr. Yun-Young. "I cannot share this food with you the same way I would with another human," he said, taking a spoonful of the warm soup. "But I can show you what it feels like to eat with someone who cares about you. I can share the experience of not being alone." He began eating slowly, savoring each bite while projecting his thoughts toward the entity. Memories of family dinners where stories were shared and laughter filled the air. Images of friends gathering after difficult days to support each other over simple meals. Recollections of his grandmother teaching him to cook, explaining that food prepared with love always tasted better than food made in haste. The entity absorbed these memories, but this time something was different. Instead of consuming them like it had done with conquered civilizations, it experienced them as gifts freely given. Young-Soo was not being absorbed or destroyed. He was choosing to share his experiences because he wanted the creature to understand what connection could feel like. For the first time in eons, the Voidwalker began to comprehend the difference between taking and receiving, between consuming and connecting. The loneliness that had driven it to destroy countless worlds began to ease, replaced by something it had never experienced before. The entity was learning what it meant to have a friend. Through the ship's sensors, they could detect massive changes in the creature's structure. The chaotic darkness was beginning to organize itself into more stable patterns. Tendrils that had been weapons of destruction started to reshape themselves into forms that could communicate more effectively with smaller beings. Young-Soo finished his meal and smiled up at the cosmic horror that surrounded their ship. "Thank you for joining me," he said simply. "Would you like me to show you more about how friendship works?" News of Young-Soo's successful contact with the Voidwalker spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Emergency broadcasts that had been announcing humanity's final hours suddenly carried a different message. The cosmic destroyer had stopped its advance toward Earth and was actually communicating with a human supply technician who had approached it with nothing but food and friendship. Dr. Choi, Yun-Young worked frantically to establish better communication protocols between Young-Soo's ship and the entity. The creature was trying to reshape itself to better interact with smaller beings, but the process was slow and difficult. For millions of years, it had existed as pure destructive force. Learning to create instead of consume required fundamental changes to its very nature. The entity's massive form began to shift and change around their small transport. The writhing darkness that had terrified entire civilizations slowly organized itself into more stable patterns. Sections of its body became translucent, allowing light to pass through for the first time since its arrival in the system. Other areas developed crystalline structures that pulsed with soft bioluminescence. "It's beautiful," Yun-Young whispered, watching the transformation through their observation ports. "It's actually trying to make itself less frightening so we can interact more comfortably." Young-Soo continued his patient work of teaching the entity about human relationships. He shared stories of his childhood, describing how his parents had cared for him when he was sick and how his friends had supported him during difficult times. He explained concepts that the creature had absorbed from conquered minds but never truly understood: loyalty, compassion, forgiveness, and unconditional love. The entity responded by sharing its own memories, but these were different from the conquest flashbacks it had shown earlier. Deep within its consciousness, it had preserved fragments of beauty from every civilization it had consumed. art and music and literature that had moved the hearts of billions of beings. The creature had been drawn to these expressions of connection without understanding why they mattered so much to their creators. Admiral Park Dong-min received reports from his fleet that defied every military manual ever written. The cosmic horror that had destroyed hundreds of worlds was now creating, rather than consuming. Small moons that had been absorbed earlier began reappearing in corrected orbits around Jupiter. The gas giant's great red spot reformed as gravitational forces returned to normal. "Sir, we're detecting massive construction activity throughout the outer system," reported Commander Kim Ji-woo. "The entity appears to be rebuilding everything it destroyed during its approach." More incredible reports followed. The entity was not just restoring planets and moons, but improving them. Dead worlds received new atmospheres perfectly suited for life. Barren asteroids were transformed into garden habitats where displaced species could establish new colonies. The creature was using its vast cosmic abilities to heal the damage it had caused during its lonely rampage across the galaxy. Other humans volunteered to join Young-Su's unprecedented diplomatic mission. Scientists, artists, teachers, and ordinary citizens who understood that first contact with a cosmic intelligence required more than military protocols. They brought their own stories, their own expressions of human culture and connection. The entity seemed particularly fascinated by human concepts of chosen family and friendship between individuals who shared no biological connection. It had absorbed countless species where relationships were based on genetic similarity or evolutionary necessity. But humans formed bonds based purely on mutual affection and shared experiences. Dr. Park Sun-young, a cultural anthropologist who had joined the mission, explained human marriage customs to the creature. Two people choosing to spend their lives together, supporting each other through good times and bad, creating new families based on love rather than survival needs. Teacher Moon Jae-min shared recordings of children learning to read, their faces lighting up with joy as they discovered new worlds through books. The entity absorbed these memories with something resembling wonder, finally understanding why knowledge and art mattered so much to the civilizations it had consumed. Chef Lee Bo-ram prepared elaborate meals that represented different human cultures, explaining how food traditions connected people to their ancestors and communities. The entity experienced these flavors through shared consciousness. Learning that eating could be about celebration and memory as much as nutrition, the creature's hunger began to fade as it discovered satisfaction in creation rather than consumption. Its loneliness, which had driven it to destroy entire civilizations, slowly eased as more humans offered genuine friendship and connection. For the first time in millions of years, the entity experienced something it had never imagined possible. It was no longer alone. The transformation was not just physical, but fundamental. The entity began referring to itself by a new name, chosen in consultation with its human friends. No longer the Void Walker, destroyer of worlds, it became simply Walker, a being that moved through the galaxy seeking connection rather than conquest. Walker started hosting gatherings where representatives from different species could meet and share their cultures. Its reformed body became a vast diplomatic station, where beings who had never been able to communicate before found common ground through shared experiences and mutual respect. The creature's greatest joy came from simple interactions that other beings took for granted. Listening to Young-Su tell stories about his grandmother's cooking, watching Yun-young work through complex scientific problems, experiencing the laughter of children who had initially been terrified, but now treated Walker as a strange but gentle friend. Military commanders across the galaxy struggled to update their threat assessments. The cosmic horror that had been their greatest fear was now actively protecting the very civilizations it had once consumed. Walker used its vast abilities to establish safe travel corridors between star systems and to defend vulnerable worlds from natural disasters. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in Walker's understanding of mortality. It had existed for billions of years and would likely continue existing long after current civilizations had faded. But now it understood that the temporary nature of individual lives made relationships more precious, not less important. Young-Su often sat quietly with Walker during the long shifts aboard their growing diplomatic station, sharing simple meals and comfortable conversation. Neither spoke much during these times, but both understood that they had discovered something rare and valuable, in the vastness of space. They had found friendship across the greatest divide imaginable, proving that even cosmic loneliness could be healed through patience, compassion, and the simple human act of sharing food with someone who needed it. 6 months after the first contact, the galaxy had transformed beyond recognition. What had once been a cosmic horror story had become the greatest diplomatic success in recorded history. Walker's reformed body stretched across the outer regions of the Sol system, no longer a writhing mass of destruction but a complex crystalline habitat that could support thousands of different life forms. Young Su, Kim walked through the central gardens of what had become known as Harmony Station, watching representatives from dozens of species work together on projects that would have been impossible before Walker's transformation. Altarian energy beings collaborated with human engineers to develop new propulsion systems. Centauri artists worked alongside vegan musicians to create art forms that combined multiple sensory experiences. The diplomatic station had become more than just a meeting place between species. It was a living symbol of what could be achieved when beings chose understanding over fear, cooperation over conflict. Walker had used its vast cosmic abilities to create specialized environments where any known life form could thrive, from methane-breathing creatures that required extreme cold to plasma-based intelligences that needed temperatures hot enough to melt steel. Dr. Choi Kun-Yang led research teams that studied the unprecedented relationship between humanity and the cosmic entity. Walker's memories contained invaluable information about thousands of lost civilizations, their scientific achievements and cultural treasures preserved within the creature's consciousness. This knowledge was freely shared with all species, accelerating technological and cultural development throughout the galaxy. But the most remarkable discoveries were not technological, but social. Walker's unique perspective as a being that had absorbed countless civilizations provided insights into how different species could work together, despite fundamental differences in biology and psychology. The entity had become a bridge between worlds, facilitating communication and understanding across barriers that had seemed impossible to cross. Youngsu's daily routine had changed very little, despite his role as humanity's primary liaison with a cosmic intelligence. He still prepared meals for the diplomatic teams, though now his kitchen served beings with dietary requirements ranging from pure energy to exotic minerals. He still listened to people's problems and offered practical advice, though now those people might be crystalline beings from distant star systems. Walker had learned to appreciate these simple interactions more than grand diplomatic ceremonies. The entity's favorite moments came during quiet conversations with Youngsu in the station's observation lounge, looking out at the stars while sharing stories about their respective experiences. Walker would tell tales of ancient civilizations that had created wonders beyond imagination, while Youngsu shared memories of his grandmother teaching him to cook or friends gathering to celebrate small victories. The entity had discovered that meaning came not from the scale of experiences but from their emotional significance. A child's first taste of ice cream carried the same weight as the construction of galactic civilizations. A friend's support during difficult times mattered as much as cosmic revelations. Walker began to understand why smaller beings treasured their brief lives so intensely. Earth's governments had initially struggled to process the implications of Youngsu's success. Military leaders trained to think in terms of threats and responses found it difficult to accept that their greatest enemy had become their strongest ally through nothing more than patience and kindness. But the results spoke for themselves. Walker actively protected human worlds from natural disasters and helped establish new colonies on planets that had been transformed into garden worlds. The entity's rehabilitation of consumed civilizations became the galaxy's greatest restoration project. Using memories preserved within its consciousness, Walker began recreating entire worlds that had been lost during its lonely rampage. These recreations were not perfect copies but new interpretations that incorporated lessons learned from the entity's growing understanding of connection and community. Species that had been extinct for thousands of years found themselves living again on worlds designed specifically for their needs, but these restored beings were not mere copies of their predecessors. They carried within themselves an understanding of loss and redemption that made them uniquely capable of appreciating the second chance they had been given. Walker's greatest achievement was not the rebuilding of worlds or the advancement of technology, but the creation of a new kind of galactic community. Species that had never interacted before found common ground through shared experiences at Harmony Station. Trade relationships evolved into genuine friendships. Military alliances transformed into cultural exchange programs. Young Su often reflected on the chain of events that had led to this transformation. A simple offer to share a meal had prevented the extinction of countless civilizations and created something unprecedented in galactic history. The universe had learned that sometimes the greatest threats were not meant to be defeated, but understood and embraced. Children from dozens of worlds came to visit Harmony Station on educational trips, their eyes wide with wonder as they met beings from across the galaxy. Walker took special pleasure in these visits, sharing gentle allusions that showed the young ones the beauty of distant worlds and the importance of treating others with kindness regardless of how different they might appear. The entity had become a teacher as well as a protector, passing on hard-won wisdom about the value of connection and the dangers of isolation. Its story became a legend told throughout the galaxy, proof that even the most alien consciousness could be reached through genuine compassion and the universal language of shared meals and honest friendship. As Young Su prepared dinner for the diplomatic teams one evening, he smiled at the thought of how ordinary his life had remained. Despite the extraordinary circumstances, he was still just a supply technician who cared about making sure everyone had enough to eat and someone to talk to when they needed it. But in a galaxy full of cosmic wonders and advanced technologies, sometimes the most ordinary human virtues prove to be the most powerful forces of all.